Summer 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. A German prisoner of war stood frozen in front of a canteen counter, staring at a brown, fizzing liquid inside a glass bottle. He had survived 2 years fighting in North Africa on hard biscuits and bitter substitute coffee. He had been told the Americans were weak, divided, and starving. He had been told that surrender meant suffering. Instead, a guard slid the bottle across the counter and said it cost 5 cents. And the same price an American child paid with pocket money. The prisoner's hands trembled as he drank his first Coca-Cola. It tasted like nothing. Nazi propaganda had prepared him for that summer. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers captured across Tunisia would arrive in the United States expecting cruelty and starvation. What they found instead was ice cream served in mess halls, chocolate bars sold for pocket change, and soldiers who once swore loyalty to a crumbling empire, slowly losing their faith in everything they had been taught. This is not a story about battles or bullets. It is the story of how a nation defeated an enemy's ideology not with weapons, but with sugar, cream, and carbonation, one bottle at a time. Make yourself comfortable with your favorite drink. Then check the time and tell us exactly what your clock says right now. We'd love to know what time people around the world are joining us. The sand of Tunisia stretched pale and endless under a sky bleached white by heat. Heinrich lay in a shallow trench that offered no real protection, only the illusion of it. His rifle jammed with grit, his canteen empty since the morning before. Around him, what remained of his unit, men he had fought beside for nearly 2 years, sat in silence, broken only by the distant thud of artillery that no longer bothered to frighten anyone. They had run out of fear the way they had run out of water. Slowly, then all at once, the heat pressed down on him like a physical weight, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and bend until distant trucks looked like they were floating above the ground. His uniform, stiff with dried sweat and dust, chafed at his neck where the collar had worn thin months ago. He could smell diesel fuel, burnt rubber, and underneath it, all the faint copper smell of blood that never quite left the air near a battlefield, even in its quiet moments. His tongue felt thick and dry against the roof of his mouth. He had stopped noticing the ache in his stomach weeks earlier, the way a man stops noticing a sound that never stops. He was 22 years old. He had joined the Afrika Korps with a head full of certainty that Germany could not lose, certainty that the men who sent him into the desert knew what they were doing, certainty that the enemy waiting on the other side of the dunes was soft, divided, and unwilling to fight for anything beyond their own comfort. 2 years of sand had worn most of that certainty away. What remained was hunger, thirst, and a dull, aching awareness that the war in North Africa was ending and not in Germany's favor. In May of 1943, it ended completely. Field Marshal Rommel was already gone, recalled to Germany weeks earlier. And the men left behind in Tunisia surrendered in numbers that staggered even the officers giving the order. Close to 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons in the span of a few days. A collapse so total that some historians would later call it a second Stalingrad. Quieter, but no less final, Heinrich raised his hands along with the rest of his unit. He expected to be shot, he had been told, more than once in barracks, conversations, and official briefings alike, that American soldiers were undisciplined, that they had no stomach for handling prisoners properly, that surrender to the Americans carried its own quiet risks. He walked forward with his hands laced behind his head, waiting for the crack of a rifle that never came. Instead, an American soldier, younger than Heinrich himself, gestured for him to sit down in the shade of a supply truck, and handed him something small and boxed. It was a ration kit, the kind American soldiers carried and routinely complained about. Heinrich opened it with the wary hands of a man expecting a trick. Inside he found biscuits, a tin of processed cheese, a chocolate bar, WWII, a packet of instant coffee, sugar tablets, and cigarette. He had not seen chocolate in over a year. His own rations, when they arrived at all in those final desert months, had been reduced to hard biscuits and a bitter substitute coffee brewed from roasted grain. Now an enemy soldier was handing him more food in a single small box than his own quartermasters had managed to deliver in a week. His fingers trembled slightly as he peeled back the wrapper on the chocolate bar. The smell hit him before the taste did, rich and sweet, a smell that belonged to a different life entirely, to Christmas mornings before the war, to a bakery near his childhood home whose name he could still picture but could no longer quite place. When he finally bit into it, the sweetness was almost unbearable. So far removed from anything his body had processed in months that his stomach clenched in protest before settling into something close to relief. He ate slowly, deliberately, the way a man eats when he is not certain the meal will be followed by another one. He was not alone in his confusion. Around him, other prisoners turned ration boxes over in their hands, murmuring to each other in low voices. Some refused to eat immediately. Suspicious that the food was drugged or poisoned, hunger eventually overcame suspicion. By the second day at the processing camps set up along the Tunisian coast, American cooks were serving pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, and milk, foods that had disappeared from the German military diet years earlier. A German officer among the prisoners would later tell representatives of the International Red Cross that they had expected to be starved as captives and instead found themselves fed better than their own army had managed in the final year of the campaign. Heinrich did not know what awaited him beyond the immediate relief of a full stomach. Rumors moved through the processing camp faster than official information. Some said the prisoners would be shipped to labor camps in the Mediterranean. Others said they would be executed once the paperwork was finished and no one back home could ask questions. Nobody said, because nobody yet believed it possible, that many of them were about to cross an ocean to a country that would feed them ice cream. The ship that carried Heinrich out of North Africa was a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced vessels rolling out of American shipyards at a pace that seemed to defy reason. He had heard vaguely of American industrial capacity before the war. He had not understood what it meant until he stood on the deck of a ship built in a matter of weeks. One of hundreds, just like it, watching the coast of Africa shrink behind him. Life aboard the ship unsettled him more than the surrender had. The prisoners were fed rations that, according to the sailors overseeing them, matched what the ship's own crew received, somewhere near 3,500 calories a day, including fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee, sweetened with sugar and milk. The ship's refrigeration held food fresh for the entire crossing, a detail that seemed unremarkable to the Americans and almost unbelievable to men who had spent 2 years watching food rot in the desert heat for lack of proper storage. On the 4th of July, partway through the crossing, the Americans did something that Heinrich would describe decades later as the moment his understanding of the world first began to crack. The crew produced ice cream churned fresh aboard the ship using a machine built for exactly that purpose, and served it to the prisoners along with the crew. Heinrich had not tasted ice cream since before the war began. He ate it, standing at the rail, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by men who had been trying to kill each other's countrymen a few weeks earlier. And he could not make sense of what he was tasting or why it was being given to him. It was not generosity in the way he understood the word. It was something stranger. It was as if the war had not touched American abundance at all, as if there was so much of everything that sharing it with a captured enemy cost nothing worth noticing. At night, lying in a hammock strung below deck, Heinrich listened to the groan of the ship's hull and the distant hum of engines that never stopped. And he found himself thinking, for the first time in years, about things other than survival. He thought about his mother rationing bread in a kitchen that grew colder each winter of the war. He thought about the last letter he had received before the surrender, its cheerful tone straining under words that could not quite hide the hunger behind them. Lying there in the dark, full for the first time in longer than he could remember. He felt a strange and unfamiliar guilt settle into his chest, heavier somehow than the fear he had carried across the desert. When the ship finally reached port at Norfolk, Virginia, Heinrich saw an America that no propaganda broadcast had prepared him for. The naval base stretched across thousands of acres of waterfront, cranes and warehouses and ships moving cargo in volumes that dwarfed anything he had seen in a European port. Even before the war had begun grinding those ports down, at the exchange near the docks, through a chain-link fence, he could see shelves stocked with candy bars from companies whose names meant nothing to him yet. Hershey, Mars, and others sold at the same nickel price charged anywhere else in the country. The journey inland surprised him further. He had expected the cattle cars he associated with prisoner transport in Europe. Instead, German prisoners were loaded onto ordinary passenger coaches, with dining cars serving full meals as the train rolled through the Virginia and Tennessee countryside. Fried chicken, vegetables, pied, and coffee were served to the prisoners not as a special gesture, he was told, but because that was simply how American trains fed their passengers. By the time the train slowed into a small station near Crossville, Tennessee, Heinrich no longer knew what to believe. Everything he had been taught about American weakness, American softness, American internal division, sat uneasily against the evidence in front of him: full plates, cold refrigeration, ice cream at sea, candy sold like it was nothing at all. He stepped off the train into the humid Tennessee summer, uncertain whether he had survived the war or simply traded one kind of disorientation for another. Camp Crossville waited beyond a wire fence, its barracks visible in neat rows, electric lights already burning against the coming dusk. The air smelled of cut grass and pine from the surrounding hills, a smell so peaceful it seemed almost obscene, given everything Heinrich had survived to reach it. Somewhere beyond the fence line, he could hear the faint sound of a radio playing music he did not recognize, and beneath it, laughter, ordinary and unhurried, the laughter of guards finishing an evening shift rather than men bracing for battle. Heinrich walked toward the gate surrounded by hundreds of other prisoners, all of them carrying the same unspoken question: if the enemy could afford to feed captured soldiers this well in the middle of a global war, what exactly had they been fighting against for the past 2 years? He did not have an answer yet. He would spend the coming months trying to find one meal at a time. Camp Crossville organized itself around routines that Heinrich had not expected to find in captivity. Reveille sounded 6 in the morning, followed by roll call, followed by breakfast in a mess hall that smelled of coffee and frying bacon, rather than the boiled grain he associated with military food. The barracks had electric lights that stayed on past sunset, hot water that ran on demand, and flush toilets that worked every time. None of it matched the image of imprisonment he had carried across the ocean. His bunk sat near a window that looked out over a stretch of Tennessee pasture, green in a way that nothing in Tunisia had ever been green, dotted with wildflowers that seemed to Heinrich almost defiantly cheerful for a place surrounded by wire fencing. At night, crickets filled the darkness with a steady, layered noise, unlike anything he remembered from home. And some nights he lay awake simply listening to it, letting the unfamiliar rhythm replace the ringing silence that had followed him out of the desert. The other men in his barracks came from every corner of the collapsed Afrika Korps, Bavarians and Rhinelanders, and a handful of Austrians. And in those first weeks they spoke mostly of home, comparing memories of bread and sausage and beer as though reciting a liturgy for a life that suddenly felt very far away. On his third day in camp, a guard walked a line of new arrivals past a low wooden building with a hand-painted sign reading canteen above the door. Heinrich had learned enough English by then to read it, though not enough to understand what waited inside. Through the screen door he could see shelves lined with items he recognized only vaguely from before the war. And some he did not recognize at all. Bottles of a dark, fizzing liquid sat stacked in wooden crates near the counter. A guard, seeing his curiosity, picked one up and set it down in front of him. 5 cents, the guard said, holding up a hand with fingers spread. Same price. An American kid pays with his allowance. Heinrich turned the bottle over in his hands. The glass was cold, beaded with condensation, despite the summer heat outside, and the liquid inside hissed faintly when he tilted it. He had never seen anything like it. He lifted it to his lips, hésitant, and the carbonation stung his tongue in a way that made him flinch before the sweetness settled in behind it. It tasted like nothing his mind had a category for, sharp and sweet and strange all at once, and for a moment he simply stood there, holding the bottle, unable to reconcile the simplicity of the drink with the impossibility of its existence in a prisoner of war camp. He would learn over the following weeks that the canteen stocked far more than the fizzing brown drink that so unsettled him. Shelves held candy bars from companies whose names he began to recognize, chocolate wrapped in bright paper, chewing gum, cigarette, and when the camp's refrigeration allowed it, ice cream in flavors he had never imagined existed outside of pre-war memory. Prisoners who worked in the camp's labor program earned wages 80 cents a day at first, later raised to a full $1, and with candy bars and bottles of Coca-Cola priced at a nickel apiece, a single day's labor could purchase more small luxuries than Heinrich had been able to obtain in Germany in the year before his capture. Luxuries that back home required connections, favors, or the black market to even glimpse. The camp assigned Heinrich to a work detail, clearing brush and repairing fences on the surrounding grounds, a labor that felt almost restful compared to the desert campaign. The kind of honest, ordinary work that left his muscles pleasantly tired rather than hollowed out with exhaustion by the end of each long day. In the evenings, he sat on the steps of his barracks with other prisoners, drinking Coca-Cola from bottles sweating in the humid air, listening to radios, playing music the guards had left within earshot, and feeling a strange, guilty contentment settle over him that he did not know how to name. Not every prisoner in the camp shared his growing unease with what he had believed before capture. Among the barracks, a faction of committed Nazi loyalists had formed its own hierarchy, one that operated in the spaces the American guards did not watch closely. These men treated the camp as an extension of the war rather than an escape from it, and they viewed prisoners who grew too comfortable with American kindness, who spoke too warmly of the food or the guards or the strange abundance surrounding them, as traitors to a cause that surrender had not ended in their minds. Heinrich watched one Zuchman, a quiet radio operator named Otto, who had made the mistake of thanking a guard too openly for an extra portion of stew, get pulled aside one night behind the mess hall. Heinrich did not see what happened, only heard about it the next morning in hushed voices, and saw Otto at breakfast with a swollen eye and a stiffness in his movements that had not been there the day before. Nobody spoke of it directly. Nobody needed to. The message moved through the camp without words. Gratitude toward the enemy carried a price, even here. Even now, even after the war that justified such loyalty had clearly begun slipping away from Germany's grasp, Heinrich learned to drink his Coca-Cola more quietly after that, to eat his ice cream without visible pleasure, to let his amazement show only in the privacy of his own thoughts. But privacy could not stop the thoughts themselves, and they multiplied faster than he could suppress them. He began watching Otto more closely in the weeks that followed, noting the way the younger man's shoulders had curled inward, the way his eyes dropped to his tray whenever a guard walked past close enough to speak to him. Otto still drank his Coca-Cola, still ate his portion of stew, but he did it now with a careful blankness on his face, the practiced emptiness of a man who had learned that visible gratitude carried consequences. Heinrich recognized the expression because he had begun wearing it himself, and the recognition unsettled him more than the beating had. It meant the fear that had ruled his life in the desert had followed him across an ocean, had found a way to survive inside a camp with electric lights and hot water and Sunday afternoon ice cream. Wearing a different uniform but answering to the same old logic of silence and submission, letters from home arrived irregular, censored and delayed, but they arrived, and each one deepened the widening gap between what Heinrich lived and what his family endured. His mother wrote about bread rationing, about a winter that had stripped the trees near their home for firewood, about a butcher's shop that had not seen meat in weeks. She wrote cheerfully, the way mothers write when they are trying to protect their sons from worry. But the cheerfulness could not fully disguise the hunger beneath her words. Heinrich read these letters sitting on his bunk with a chocolate bar half eaten in his hand, and the sweetness in his mouth turned bitter each time he reached the final line. He began to understand, slowly and without wanting to, that his life had inverted itself. He had been captured, stripped of his weapon, his freedom, his uniform's dignity, and yet he ate better, slept warmer, and lived more comfortably than the family he had left behind, fighting for a cause that was, by every visible measure, failing to provide for its own people even as it continued to demand their sacrifice. He took to reading his mother's letters twice, once quickly, hungry for any word of her well-being, and then again slowly, searching between the lines for details she had not meant to include. He noticed how her handwriting grew smaller toward the bottom of each page, as though she were rationing the paper itself. He noticed how she asked about his health with a kind of desperate brightness, never once asking what he ate, perhaps because she could not bear to hear an answer that might remind her of what her own kitchen lacked. He began hiding his candy wrappers at the bottom of a small trunk beneath his bunk, not from the guards, who did not care, but from himself, unable to look at the evidence of his own abundance while composing replies that carefully avoided any mention of it. Summer deepened into a season Heinrich would remember for the rest of his life as the season of ice cream. On a Sunday afternoon in July, camp administrators organized what the guards called a social, setting up hand-cranked freezers near the mess hall and packing them with ice hauled in from a nearby ice house, along with cream, sugar, and flavorings measured out with the casual generosity of men who did not fear running out. Prisoners took turns cranking the handles, laughing despite themselves at the absurdity of the task, watching as the mixture inside slowly thickened into something Heinrich had not eaten since he was a boy, standing outside a shop window in Munich, pressing his face against the glass to watch other children eat what his family could not afford. Even then, the ice cream that afternoon came in only a few flavors, vanilla and something the Americans called strawberry. But by the following summer, camps like Crossville had acquired electric freezers that produced a variety Heinrich found almost dizzying chocolate, butter pecan flavors he had no German words for at all. He purchased ice cream bars from the canteen for a dime, when his wages allowed it, and ice cream sandwiches for the same price. and he ate them sitting in the shade of the barracks, watching guards walk past without urgency, without fear, without the constant vigilance that had defined every waking moment of his life in North Africa. Sugar itself became a quiet obsession among the prisoners, not because it was rationed carefully, but because it was not rationed at all. Bowls of it sat uncovered on the mess hall tables, available to anyone who wanted to sweeten their coffee or their cereal without limit. In Germany, sugar had been among the most tightly controlled commodities of the war, doled out in small monthly portions when it was available at all. Here, it sat abandoned in open bowls, and Heinrich once watched kitchen staff discard several large sacks of it after summer humidity had hardened the contents. Rather than take the time to salvage what remained, he stood at the doorway of the kitchen that day and stared at the discarded sacks with something close to physical pain, understanding, for the first time, the true scale of the gap between the two nations. He now stood between, as the labor shortage across the American countryside intensified, camp administrators began sending prisoners out on agricultural details beyond the fence line, and Heinrich volunteered for every opportunity, eager for the change of scenery and the extra wages it offered. He spent weeks working in orchards, picking fruit destined for canneries and packing houses. And it was there, more than anywhere else, that the scale of American abundance revealed itself to him in full. He watched supervisors at a nearby cannery reject baskets of perfectly edible fruit for minor blemishes, imperfections that would have made no difference at all to a hungry family in Germany. Fruit that was simply diverted to animal feed rather than sold or preserved. He stood in a field one afternoon watching a single farm's harvest of sugar beets stretch toward the horizon in every direction. More sugar beets, he was told by another prisoner who had grown up on a farm in Silesia, than his entire home region could produce. In a season, the mechanization amazed him nearly as much as the abundance. Machines did work that would have required dozens of men and horses back home, and did it faster, and did it without apparent strain on the nation's resources, even as that nation fought a war on two fronts across two oceans. The orchard work left his hands stained purple with cherry juice by the end of each shift, and his back ached in ways that reminded him, almost fondly, of harvest seasons before the war. He liked the rhythm of it. The ladder against the branch, the basket filling slowly beneath the sun, the brief conversations with the American farmhands who supervised the details and sometimes shared cigarettes with the prisoners during breaks without any of the careful distance the guards maintained back at camp. One farmhand, an older man, missing two fingers on his left hand from some accident he never explained, once handed Heinrich a whole basket of cherries, too small for the cannery standards, and told him simply to eat as many as he wanted before they spoiled. Heinrich sat in the shade of the orchard that afternoon, eating cherries until his stomach ached, thinking of the fruit stalls back home that had stood empty for 2 winters running. And he found he could not decide whether to feel grateful or ashamed. When November arrived, the camp prepared for a holiday. Heinrich had only read about in books an American celebration called Thanksgiving that seemed to exist for no reason beyond gratitude and food. The mess hall staff spent days preparing, and on the day itself, prisoners sat down to a meal that stunned even those among them who had grown accustomed to American abundance over the preceding month. Roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes drowning in gravy, sweet potatoes glazed with sugar, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk, the same meal, prisoners were told, being served to American soldiers in mess halls across the world. That same day, Heinrich sat with his tray in front of him, unable for a long moment to begin eating. The sheer equality of it struck him harder than the food itself. He was a captured enemy soldier, a man who had spent 2 years trying to help defeat the nation, now feeding him And yet the meal in front of him was identical to what the victors gave their own men. Nazi ideology had taught him a strict hierarchy of worth, German superiority above all others. And here sat evidence that the nation supposedly built on weakness and division could not even be bothered to distinguish between friend and enemy when it came to a holiday meal. Around him, the mess hall filled with the particular warmth of shared abundance, steam rising off serving trays, the low murmur of hundreds of men eating at once, a guard near the door, humming along to a song playing faintly from a radio in the kitchen. Someone near Heinrich's table said a brief word of thanks under his breath before eating, an old habit from childhood surfacing unexpectedly in a place built to punish him. Heinrich found himself doing the same quietly, not from religious conviction, but from something closer to bewilderment, a need to mark the strangeness of the moment with some gesture larger than simply picking up a fork. December brought a different kind of disorientation entirely. As Christmas approached, packages began arriving at the camp, not from military sources, but from ordinary American civilians and church groups and charitable organizations moved by some impulse. Heinrich struggled to understand homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, hand-knitted socks, small toys, writing paper, candy pressed into tins by women whose sons were very likely fighting German soldiers on the other side of the world. In the nearby town, townspeople who had lost neighbors and relatives to the war against Germany nonetheless organized deliveries of baked goods to the camp gates, handing packages to guards to distribute among men they had every reason to despise. Heinrich received one of these packages himself, a small tin of cookies with a handwritten note in English that a fellow prisoner translated for him haltingly. The note wished him a safe Christmas and a swift return home to his family. He sat with the tin in his lap for a long time that evening, turning the note over in his hands, trying to reconcile the kindness of strangers with the propaganda that had painted these same people as soulless and morally bankrupt. He could not do it. The reconciliation refused to happen. No matter how he arranged the pieces in his mind, it was in the early months of the following year that the final and most devastating piece of information reached the camp. Carried in smuggled newspapers and murmured conversations among prisoners who worked details outside the fence and overheard things not meant for their ears. Reports began circulating about camps in Germany and occupied Europe. Camps, unlike Crossville, in every conceivable way, places of systematic starvation and murder operating under the same flag Heinrich had once worn with pride. The reports were fragmented, difficult to verify, dismissed at first by many prisoners as enemy fabrication designed to break their morale, but the fragments accumulated detail by detail, and Heinrich found himself unable to dismiss them as easily as some of his barrack mates managed. He thought of Otto's swollen eye, of the quiet brutality. Some of his fellow prisoners were capable of even here, in a camp with full stomachs and Coca-Cola and ice cream on Sunday afternoons. If men could do that to each other over a simple, thankful smile directed at an enemy, what were they capable of doing to people they had been taught for a decade to view as something less than human entirely? He lay awake many nights that spring, turning the question over without finding an answer that let him sleep. He thought of every time he had lowered his eyes and said nothing rather than risk becoming the next target of the men who ruled the barracks through fear. He wondered how many silences like his own, repeated across a whole nation for over a decade, had allowed the reports now reaching him to become possible at all. It was not an easy thought, and it did not resolve into anything as clean as guilt or innocence. It simply sat in his chest alongside the ice cream and the Coca-Cola and the letters from his mother, one more impossible thing he now had to carry. The camp fractured quietly in the months that followed, not through open conflict, but through 1,000 small withdrawals. Prisoners who stopped defending the regime in barracks conversations, prisoners who stopped speaking at all, Prisoners who sat alone with their thoughts during meals that continued without interruption to be more abundant than anything their starving homeland could offer. Heinrich became one of these quiet men, eating his ice cream in silence, drinking his Coca-Cola without pleasure, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the slow, unbearable dismantling of everything he had once believed himself certain of. By the time spring approached, Heinrich understood that he had lost something far larger than a war. He had lost the ground beneath his convictions, and no amount of sugar or chocolate could sweeten the particular bitterness of that discovery. He continued to work, to eat, to survive the strange, comfortable captivity that defined his days. But he did so now as a man watching his own beliefs dissolve in real time, with nothing yet built to replace them. He still walked to the canteen most evenings, still bought his bottle of Coca-Cola for a nickel. But the ritual had changed its meaning entirely. What had once felt like a small, guilty pleasure now felt like an act of quiet mourning, a way of sitting with the wreckage of everything he had once been certain of. While the Tennessee evening settled gold and orange over the hills beyond the fence, he would uncap the bottle, listen to the faint hiss of escaping gas, and drink slowly, no longer tasting sweetness so much as absence. The absence of a worldview that had once felt as solid as the desert sand beneath his boots, and now felt like nothing at all, dissolved as completely and as quietly as sugar stirred into warm water. Spring of 1945 brought newsreels to the camp theater that Heinrich watched in a silence so complete he could hear the projector's mechanical hum beneath the narrator's voice. American soldiers advancing through the collapsing remains of the Reich appeared on the screen, handing chocolate bars and sticks of gum to German children who stood in bombed-out streets, their faces caught between hunger and disbelief that mirrored almost exactly the disbelief Heinrich had felt 2 years earlier, standing at a canteen counter with a nickel bottle of Coca-Cola in his hand. The soldiers, advancing into a defeated enemy's homeland, carried enough sweetness in their pockets to give some of it away. The government that had promised those same children 1,000 years of glory had left them standing in rubble with empty stomachs. Then came the other reels, the ones nobody in the theater was prepared for: liberated camps, gates thrown open, survivors reduced to skeletal frames, photographs standing beside American soldiers who knelt to share their own rations with the men and women they found behind the wire. Heinrich sat through those images with his hands pressed flat against his knees, unable to look away and unable, afterward, to speak. Around him, the theater had gone completely silent, a silence unlike any he had heard in the camp before. No coughing, no shifting of boots against the wooden floor. Only the projector's steady clicking and the narrator's flat, unhurried voice, describing things no voice should have to describe so calmly. He thought of Otto's swollen eye. He thought of every silence he had kept in barracks, conversations over 2 years of captivity. Every moment he had lowered his gaze, rather than speak against the men who ruled the barracks. Through fear alone, he thought of his own 2 years of hunger in the desert. Real, but survivable. Nothing at all beside what the screen now showed him. He understood, finally and completely, that the abundance he had witnessed in America and the horror unfolding in these newsreels were not separate stories at all, but two faces of the same terrible truth about what his country had become and what he had once been willing to serve. Some men in the theater wept openly. Others sat rigid, faces unreadable. The way Heinrich imagined stone might look if stone could feel shame. A few, the same hardcore of loyalists who had once ruled the barracks through quiet threats, muttered that the reels were staged, exaggerated enemy propaganda designed to humiliate them even in defeat. Heinrich watched their faces carefully and understood, perhaps for the first time with total clarity, that men could look directly at the truth and still choose, out of pride or fear or something closer to spiritual exhaustion, to refuse it, the war ended that May, though for prisoners like Heinrich, captivity continued for many more months while the machinery of occupation and repatriation slowly turned. He spent that final stretch of confinement in a kind of suspended waiting, no longer certain what awaited him across the ocean. No longer certain the man who would step off the ship in Germany bore much resemblance to the soldier who had boarded one in Norfolk 2 years earlier. When repatriation finally came in the winter of 1946, Heinrich boarded a ship heading east with a small bag of belongings and a wooden crate. The camp administration had allowed him to pack with items purchased from his labor wages: cans of coffee, bars of chocolate, tins of meat, small treasures meant for a family he had not seen in nearly 3 years. He stood at the rail during the crossing much as he had 2 years before, though this time the ocean carried him toward uncertainty rather than away from danger. Germany, when he finally reached it, bore almost no resemblance to the country he remembered. Entire blocks of his hometown had collapsed into rubble, chimneys standing alone where houses had once stood. Children in the streets, thin, in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of the newsreels from the liberated camps. The train that carried him those final miles home crawled past cratered fields and burned-out vehicles, still rusting at the roadside. And the station itself, once a building he remembered as grand and busy, stood roofless, its platform crowded with returning soldiers and refugees who all seemed to share the same hollow, searching expression. His mother met him at the door of what remained of their house, and Heinrich, who had gained weight steadily throughout his captivity, stood in stark and painful contrast to the gaunt woman who embraced him, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had thinned from years of rationing, that had only worsened as the war ground toward its collapse. She held him for a long moment on the doorstep, saying nothing, and Heinrich felt through the thinness of her shoulders exactly how much the war had taken from her while he, a prisoner of the enemy, had wanted for almost nothing at all. He opened his wooden crate that first evening and watched his mother's hand shake as she lifted out a bar of chocolate, turning it over as though she had forgotten. Such things could still exist in the world. His younger sister, who had been a child when he left for North Africa and was now nearly grown, tasted real coffee for the first time in years and wept quietly at the kitchen table without any embarrassment at all. Heinrich sat watching his family taste, in small ration portions, the same abundance he had once found so disorienting, and felt the guilt of those 2 years finally begin to loosen its grip, replaced by something closer to purpose. He spent the following months doing what small work he could find amid the wreckage of the local economy, and in quiet conversations with neighbors and former soldiers, he found himself returning again and again to the same theme, one that surprised him each time he heard himself say it aloud. The strength he had witnessed in America had not come from cruelty or conquest. It had come from production, from factories that never stopped running, from farms that could afford to waste food while feeding a global war effort, from a system that manufactured abundance, so total it could be casually extended even to captured enemies. Germany's path forward, he came to believe, could not be rebuilt through old dreams of domination. It would have to be built the way America had built its own strength, through making things, through the unglamorous machinery of production and distribution that turned scarcity into plenty. He was not alone in this thinking. Other former prisoners returning from American camps carried similar impressions home with them. Tempered through the same slow education in supermarkets, they had not yet seen standardized goods. They had only glimpsed through canteen shelves, and a wartime economy that had somehow found room for ice cream socials, even while building ships every few dozen hours. In the years that followed, as West Germany began its long climb out of the rubble, Some of these men found themselves, almost by accident, among the merchants, engineers, and businessmen who helped import American products and American methods into a rebuilding nation. Understanding the appeal of both in a way few of their countrymen who had stayed behind ever could, Heinrich kept for the rest of his life a small and private ritual on warm summer evenings when he could afford it. He bought himself a bottle of Coca-Cola, imported it first and later, bottled locally, once the company returned to German markets at decade's end, and he drank it slowly on his back step, remembering a hot afternoon on the deck of a troop ship in the middle of the Atlantic and a bowl of ice cream he had not understood how to accept. Sometimes, sitting alone on that step with the bottle sweating in his hand, he thought of Camp Crossville itself, of the green Tennessee hills beyond the wire, of the sound of crickets at night, so different from anything he had known before or since. It struck him as strange that a place built to hold him against his will had also become, in its own complicated way, the place where he had first learned what a nation at peace with its own abundance might look like, a lesson Germany was only beginning, slowly and painfully, to learn for itself. He never spoke often about his years of captivity, not because the memory shamed him, but because it defied simple explanation. He had been fed by his enemies more generously than his own government had fed him. He had been shown kindness by strangers who had every reason to hate him. He had watched his convictions dissolve not through argument or punishment, but through the slow, accumulating evidence of a nation that could win a war and still find room to serve dessert to the men it had defeated. When his own children asked him, years later, what America had been like, he would tell them simply that it tasted like sugar and carbonation, and that it had taught him more about the true measure of strength than 2 years of war ever had. He died an old man, decades after the war's end, in a Germany transformed almost beyond recognition from the ruined country he had returned to in 1946. In his final years, he sometimes told his grandchildren about a bottle of Coca-Cola that had cost 5 cents in a prisoner of war camp in Tennessee, and about ice cream served in the middle of an ocean to men who had crossed it as enemies. He told them that the war had been lost long before Germany's formal surrender, lost the moment men like himself understood that the nation they had been sent to destroy could afford, even amid the worst of its own sacrifices, to be generous to those who had tried to destroy it. That, he would say, was a kind of strength no army could ever match, and no propaganda could ever fully explain away. No matter how many years passed, or how far the world moved on from the war that had taught him so much,